Well, good morning. It's been probably 10 years since I have been to ladies class, and I am so thrilled to be here with y'all. Laura called me this summer. Well, first she texted and said, call me. But I tell you, I think God prepared me to come talk to y'all about grace way before she called me. Laura. Because do you ever have those seasons where just there's that word that's put on your heart? And grace is one of them. So now that it's out of my system, for those that know me, this is what I do. And I thought, let me get it done at the beginning, and so the rest we can just. So surprised by grace. This is one of the chapters from Andy Stanley's book, The Grace of God. If you have not read this book, I encourage you to read it. It is just chapter after chapter of God revealing who he is through grace. So this book is one that allows us to see through grace glasses and discover that God has a plan of grace from the very beginning of time. Grace is not reserved for good people. Grace underscores the goodness of God. We are familiar with the idea of sowing and reaping. It's also known as the law of the harvest. The principal phrase comes in a variety of flavors. You reap what you sow. You get what you have coming. What goes around comes around. Actions have consequences. Just to put a note, I use this phrase a lot. I coach and train real estate agents at Westmark companies. And so for them to do their business, you've got to dig and do the things. This is a very familiar concept to many of us. These principles can work for you, or they can work against you. Driving over the speed limit equals a ticket. Paying your electric bill late, a late fee. Academic diligence equals good grades. Making coffee at home versus going to Starbucks, Laura, saves you $5 a day or $25 a week. This cause and effect principle is foundational in human experience. It's also taught and illustrated in both the Old and in the New Testament. We could only assume that God established this principle about the same time that he did like law of gravity and other laws of physics. The idea behind any principle is that it makes certain components of life relatively predictable. And that's a good thing, right? Andy Stanley had great visuals that I want to share. I would hate to get to retirement and discover that a penny saved is a penny lost. Or worse, that there was a way to double my carb intake while avoiding exercise. I understand the impression that the principle of sowing and reaping determines the relationship. I understand the impression that the principle of sowing and reaping determines the relationship between what I eat and what I weigh. While the principle of sowing and reaping continues to be operational in our world, there are in fact exceptions. Like me, you have seen some hardworking, responsible people who did everything right financially, fall on hard times because of circumstances that are completely beyond their control. You've also known people who have taken really good care of their bodies that were eventually destroyed by disease. But I think we also have seen some dishonest people prosper too. But the good news, there's another exception to the principle of sowing and reaping. This one is not the result of the brokenness caused by sin. This exception is the result of God's love and his mercy. The exception that I'm referring to is grace. Just as sin sometimes results in bad things happening to good people, grace creates the possibility of good things happening to undeserving people. The presence of sin means sometimes we don't get the good that we deserve. The presence of grace means that sometimes we don't get the consequences that we deserve. Grace is the vehicle that God uses on occasion to ensure that we are getting precisely what we don't deserve. Moved by love, he turned the world's capricious cruelties into divine opportunities for good people. And he even uses the evil intentions of bad people to redeem them. When I think about brother stories in the Bible, I automatically think of like Jacob and Esau or Cain and Abel. But this brother story might just be the best illustration of God's grace. Joseph, an uncommonly good man, suffers unspeakable injustice, while Judah, a wily, callous hypocrite, enjoys undeserved prosperity and popularity. As it just so happens, God had a plan for both of them. Jacob. And I'm about to tell stories that we are all familiar with, but hopefully, as I reveal Joseph and Judah's story, that you'll see something different, something that might could relate to each of us, or even to people that are close to us. So I feel like I'm really about to start talking to the people that taught me all these things. So just bear with me. So Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, fathered 12 sons with 4 different women. As we are all familiar, Jacob put little, if any, effort into hiding the fact that Rachel was his favorite wife, and that he loved her 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin, more than the other 10 sons combined. He shamelessly doted over Joseph, sparing him the most difficult chores and showering him with special gifts, including a spectacular, colorful coat. That coat was a daily reminder to Joseph's brothers that they would never earn the kind of love that Joseph received from their father so freely. Joseph later proved to be a supremely good man, but he wasn't perfect. Their family raised sheep and goats as a part of their agricultural existence. And back then, shepherds truly led their flocks to the greenest pastures they could find, even if it meant it would take them several days to get there. Joseph, at the amazing age of 17, I have an almost 17-year-old, 17, took it upon himself to become his father's eyes and ears, informing on his brothers when they didn't manage the flocks well. I could just imagine this scene one evening. Joseph and his brothers sat around a campfire, perhaps the bleating of sheep in the background, and he's stirring the coals of the campfire and starts in like this. In Genesis 37:6, he said, "Listen to the dream I had. We were all in the field tying up sheaves of wheat when my sheaf got up and stood up straight. Yours formed a circle around mine and bowed down to it. Do you think you're going to be a king and rule over us?" his brothers asked. So they hated him even more because of his dreams and because of what he said about them. Over time, their hatred for Joseph festered. I can only imagine that teenage Joseph probably didn't have a fully frontal lobe developed. Anybody been around this? He really seemed oblivious to his efforts on others because he continually shared his dreams. So picking up in Genesis 37:9, then Joseph had another dream and told his brothers, "I had another dream. in which I saw the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowing down to me. He also told the dream to his father, and his father scolded him. What kind of dream is that? Do you think that your mother and your brothers and I are going to come and bow down to you? In verse 11, it says that his brothers were jealous, but his father kept this in mind. Because if y'all remember, Jacob also had some encounters with visions and dreams that seemed really weird at the time, but then came true. Hatred is rarely a passive thing. It's more than an emotion. Hatred is nothing less than murder waiting to happen. Only fear of getting caught keeps hate-filled people from bringing despised person to a sudden end. That's pretty scary, especially in a culture where we are flippantly using the word hate. Several months later, Jacob sent his favorite son to check on his brothers. The 10 brothers were about 60 miles north in a lush valley, again, going towards the greenest pastures. Joseph traveled alone through 60 miles of wilderness to find his family's flock. When he appeared over the horizon, the men sneered. Here comes the dream master. They unanimously agreed that this day would be his last. Their plan: kill him and dump his body into a pit. When scavengers would devour every trace of him, they would tell their father the truth. Joseph had been eaten by a wild animal. It's probably more half-truth. That's probably where they were. But Reuben, the oldest brother, talked the others out of killing him. Throw him into the pit alive. Letting him die on his own means we won't have his blood on our hands. His plan later was to come back and rescue him. The brothers were reluctant, but they agreed. When Joseph arrived, the 10 brothers pounced on him, stripped the multicolored coat from his body, and threw him into the dry cistern. Joseph cried out for help. Echoes came from the hole that he was in. But at the same time, his brothers sat and shared a meal and debated Joseph's fate. About that time, a caravan of Ishmaelite traders rolled across the valley. Loaded with camels with merchandise to sell in Egypt, Judah emerged as a leader among his brothers. Unlike Reuben, who hoped to rescue his brother, Judah found a way to compound their sin and make some cash while they were at it. Genesis 37, verse 26, Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. Judah veiled his greed beneath a thin veneer of mercy. In years to come, he would perfect this skill and become a master of disguise. Then the men pulled Joseph from the cistern, turned him over to the traders, and divided the silver 10 ways, and watched as the caravan disappeared over the southern horizon. Never expecting to see their dreaming brother again. And there it was. The principle of sowing and reaping gone awry. The good kid gets thrown into a pit and sold into slavery. The evil brothers profit by it. And if you know the story, you know it gets even worse. For the brothers, the only unanswered question at this point was what to tell their dad. Splash a little goat's blood on their brother's coat, maybe rip a few tears in it. Let's make it convincing. It's a great alibi. Genesis 37, verse 32. We found this. Examine to see whether it's your son's robe. He recognized it and said, "It's my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Perhaps it was at this moment that the 10 brothers truly realized the weight of their deception. Their father's grief would serve as a continual reminder. For years to come, Judah and his brothers would be forced to carry their secret. Long after the silver was gone, the memory would remain. I don't know, but perhaps Judah did regret the role he played as the mastermind in the conspiracy. But if it were true, there was no evidence. Anybody else's nose running? In time, Judah mastered the skill of hiding his true private self behind an honorable public facade. And so the wicked prospered while the innocent suffered. The biblical narrative follows Joseph to Egypt, where he became a central character in the story of Israel's history. He gets falsely accused of rape and sentenced to prison, but nevertheless, he maintained his grip on integrity, and eventually, God lifted Joseph above his circumstances to establish him as a leading national figure in Egypt. Meanwhile, Judah's story goes from bad to worse. Judah moves on with Joseph out of the picture. He relocates to a town several miles from home, marries a local woman, and started having a family. He fathered 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. When became a man, Judah arranged his marriage to a woman named Tamar. Unfortunately for her, proved to be such an evil man that the Lord ended his life early. Genesis 38:7. Leaving Tamar widowed and childless, a very desperate situation back then. Ancient culture had a tradition called levirate marriage that protected childless widows from poverty and destruction. According to this custom, one of the dead man's relatives could claim his estate, marry his widow, take care of her, and father children with her. Usually this would be a brother, but in Canaanite law, any eligible relative could fulfill the duties. Keeping with tradition, Tamar married brother Onan. Unfortunately, he was also displeasing in the sight of the Lord and died. Genesis 38:10. Man, this must have really had Judah thinking, is this a pattern? 2 sons married Tamar and quickly died. According to the Bible, they did as a result of their own evil, not because of Tamar. Nonetheless, Judah wasn't exactly eager to send his 3rd son to suffer the same fate. Judah could refuse to uphold the custom, but then his community would label him irresponsible, dishonorable, dishonest. He did not want that reputation of a man. He did not want the reputation of a man that would not care for his family. I mean, how can you trust a man to honor his business contracts or even trust him to run for public office if he was this kind of man? So Judah approached Tamar with a compromise. Genesis 38:11. Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up." For he thought, he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. It sounded reasonable on the surface, and it helped Judah maintain his honorable public persona, but it was a promise that he had no intention of keeping. Tamar faithfully fulfilled her part of the agreement, but when Sheila grew to become an adult and became eligible for marriage, nothing. When Judah's own wife died, he could have fulfilled the promise, but nothing. By this time, Tamar found herself to be in a vulnerable position. Older and fewer childbearing years left. What if her father died? She would have no means to support herself. So she decided to take matters into her own hands. Each spring, wealthy men left their homes to personally oversee the harvest of wool and enjoy the time of celebration. Wine, wool, and women put rich men like Judah in an agreeable mood. If you had a debt to collect, now is the time to collect that debt. If you needed to ask anyone to fulfill an obligation, now is the time to do that. This was the time and the place. Tamar had no intention of asking Judah for anything, but rather give him a dose of his own deception medicine. Genesis 38:13. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance of Enim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Sheila had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face, not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law. Freaking scripture real quick. The fact that he didn't even recognize her tells you a couple things. He didn't check in on her well-being, and he also didn't give her any reassurance that he was still going to take care of her. He went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat for my flock." I don't know why that's so funny. It's just goat. It's the going rate. Tamar knew better than to trust Judah's promise. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she said, or asked. He said, "What pledge should I give you?" "Your seal and its cord," also known as his signet, "and the staff in your hand," she asked, or answered. In today's standard, it'd be like, could you leave your social security card and your driver's license as a guarantee that this is going to happen? A few days later, here we go. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. So a few days later, he sent his servant with the goat to swap for his signet and his staff, but the prostitute was nowhere to be found. He asked the men around the temple about the prostitute, but they replied there wasn't one. When this got back to Judah, instead of embarrassing himself, he let the matter go. A few months passed, and well, Tamar's tummy started to grow. Soon people began to talk, and eventually the town gossip reached Judah. His daughter-in-law had played the harlot, and she was pregnant. Yep, Judah reacted just as you could imagine a person who's hiding a secret sin. He was outraged, and strong with his self-righteous tone about himself, he burned with righteous anger. He would publicly take Tamar down as an opportunity to seal his hypocrisy. Genesis 38, starting in the second part of verse 24, Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." Isn't this the same Judah who plotted to kill his brother sold his brother into slavery because killing him wouldn't yield a profit. The same Judah who broke his father's heart. Isn't this the same Judah who promised to take care of his widowed daughter-in-law, yet never intended to do so? Genesis 38:25. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I am pregnant with the man who owns these, she said. And she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. Tamar had irrefutable evidence. Tamar's plan had worked perfectly. By waiting until the last second, she left Judah nowhere to hide. The crowd had already gathered to watch Tamar burn. Judah was forced to call off the execution and dismiss the charges. There was the crowd's answer. Judah had promised to take care of his widowed daughter-in-law, yet had not intended to follow through. Judah had used the body of a harlot in secret, yet he was ready to publicly condemn Tamar for behaving like one. To keep herself from becoming destitute, she tricked Judah into fulfilling his promise. This entire story, this entire episode is strange and crazy to me. But it was a turning point for Judah. He was exposed as a hypocrite, as a liar, as a swindler. His public confession was to the point. Genesis 38, verse 26. Judah recognized them, the staff and the signet, and said, she is more righteous than I. Since I wouldn't give her my son, she will. Now, if Judah's story ended here, we may be tempted to conclude that he got a measure of what he deserved. He got what he had coming. But did he really reap what he sowed? I hardly think that a stint of public humiliation compared to almost burning his daughter-in-law at the stake. That's not really reaping what you sow. Remember, he also sold his brother with no known consequences at this point. Judah's story doesn't end here. Some 20 years later, since Judah and his brothers had sold Joseph, let me start that over. Some 20 years had passed since Judah and his brothers sold Joseph. I can only imagine that they would have never guessed that Joseph would have risen into power in Egypt after his series of misfortunes. Joseph rose in political power and launched a massive government food campaign. Store up grain reserves for 7 years to hopefully survive the predicted 7-year famine. This campaign reached beyond Egypt. It was a way of survival for all of the Mediterranean. The famine hit Jacob's family especially hard. So he sent his sons to Egypt for provision. All of his sons, that is, except Benjamin. We know why. He was the surviving son of Rachel. He couldn't bear to lose another favored son. So after a long, dusty trip to Egypt, Joseph's brothers waited among many that waited, anxiously, I assume, for their ration of grain. When it was their turn, they appeared before the government official in charge of selling grain. Joseph wore the makeup and official garb worn by Egyptian officers, and he even spoke with a native Egyptian accent. Genesis 42, verse 6. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, They bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. The 10 brothers observed standard protocol when they bowed down, addressing royalty. What a significant moment. Joseph's dream had come to fruition. Playing a role as a suspicious bureaucrat, Joseph tested his brothers to see if they had changed. He also wanted to know if Benjamin had fallen prey to their brothers. Simeon was held captive while the other brothers were sent back home with grain and were demanded to bring Benjamin with them when they returned to Egypt for more food. I can only imagine what Jacob's reaction would look like. He had no desire to let Benjamin out of his sight. Genesis 42, verse 35. As they were emptying their sacks, there in each man's sack was his pouch of silver. And when they and their father saw the money pouches, they were frightened. Their father Jacob said to them, "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin? Everything is against me." But their grain supply began to run low again, and they would need to make another trip to Egypt. So Judah made his father a vow. Genesis 42, verses 8 and 9. Then Judah said to Israel, his father, "Send the boy along with me, and we will go at once, so that we and you and our children may live and not die. I myself will guarantee his safety. You can hold me personally responsible for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him here before you, I will bear the blame before you all my life." Jacob finally agreed. They needed food desperately. So when Judah and his brothers appeared before Joseph, again, all 11 of them bowed down to him. A dream coming reality again. To their surprise, Joseph hosted a banquet in their honor. This was to give him the opportunity to see how the brothers interacted. He watched them closely for signs of hatred for Benjamin, but there was no hatred, just sorrow. They regretted what they had done to Joseph and the pain it burdened on their father. At last, Joseph had one more test. Sending his brothers off and loading their donkeys, a silver cup, as we all know, was hidden among Benjamin's things. As they passed the city gates, Joseph directed his officers to accuse them of theft, and they searched their belongings. The silver cup was found. Benjamin was promptly arrested and threatened to be kept as a slave. How would Joseph's brothers react? Would they sacrifice him to save themselves? Would they save him? Judah had personally guaranteed Benjamin's safety. But he doesn't have the best follow-through track record. Nonetheless, Judah had a private word with Joseph. Genesis 44, verse 32. Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, if I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. Now then, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father. Joseph wouldn't contain his emotions. He cleared the room of any officials, translators, when it was just Joseph and his brothers left in the room. Genesis 45:3. I am Joseph. And once again, his brothers bowed down. But this time it was out of fear. Judah, with the most fear. What would he do if the roles were reversed? What goes around comes around. For more than 20 years, he outran his consequences. He was going to get what he had coming. But there was no sound of guards rushing into the room. There wasn't an order of arrest. It was calm. Strangely calm. This day would be a day that Judah would never forget. A day of grace. Judah was given precisely what he didn't deserve. Genesis 45, verse 5. Joseph is speaking. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Have you ever been shocked at an outcome? Have you ever thought, I know exactly how this is about to play out? How long did it take Joseph's brothers to compute or comprehend what just happened? Guilt. It's a heavy burden. A burden that is dark, lonely, and it strips you of any confidence or willingness to look a person in the eyes. Especially if that person is involved with what your guilt is from. Joseph's brothers were consumed with guilt, but Joseph was consumed with something else. Grace. Joseph not only forgave his brothers, but he invited his family to live in the most lush, fertile territory in Egypt. Within a moment, Judah and his brothers went from condemned to death to esteemed guests from the second most powerful man in Egypt. And again, the law of sowing and reaping was prevented. But this time, it was prevented by grace. Many years later, Jacob was close to death. The 12 sons gathered to receive his blessing. According to tradition, one would receive a double portion of the estate and bear the title firstborn, making him the official head of the household. Normally, this honor would be given to the oldest son, but a father could choose anyone at his discretion. You could imagine that the brothers had already come to the conclusion that Joseph, the favorite son, the son that through many obstacles that he had handled, with the most utmost integrity, impressive leadership, all the morals, did it just right, he was the one. That's who he's going to choose. Reuben, the eldest son, stepped forward. Jacob denied him the privilege. He had slept with one of Jacob's concubines. Simeon was next. He didn't receive it either. He had a violent temper, and he and Levi had slaughtered an entire town to defend their sister. Levi heard what his father said to Simeon and knew better than to step forward. So instead, he nudged Judah. Reluctant, he approached his father. His secret was public now. He masterminded Joseph being sold into slavery and watched his father grieve his death for years. He led a double life while his brother Joseph was a slave in Egypt. As Judah approached his father, he knelt at his feet, and this is what he heard from his father. Genesis 49, verses 8 and 10. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. This family eventually, as we know, became a nation where Jacob's 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. And beginning with King David, the kings of Israel were born to the tribe of Judah. Even more significant, Jesus, Israel's Messiah, our Messiah, was born from the lineage of Judah. God chose to bring the Messiah into the world through the lineage of Judah, not Joseph. After a lifetime of sin and hypocrisy, Judah was brought to a place of humility and gratitude. He was brought there by grace. Did Judah find grace? No. He never went looking for it. Grace found Judah. Through each detail of Judah's story, God continued to weave the theme of grace into the story of all mankind. For Judah's story, it is revealed that grace is not reserved for good people. Grace underscores the goodness of God. So the principle, sowing and reaping. You reap what you sow. You get what you have coming. What goes around comes around. Actions have consequences. It's the natural order, the way most cultures and communities define fairness, and how families, friends, colleagues, and other social groups often operate. But this is not grace. Grace is getting what we least deserve. Human nature is to try and earn grace. Base it on performance. We try to earn God's favor. It'd be like me trying to throw a surprise birthday party for myself. No surprise there. Judah was shown grace, not because he deserved it, but because God is so good. We have been shown grace through Jesus dying for our sins, not because we deserve it, but because God is so good. We've all been the witness of grace. We've all been the receiver of grace. We have also given grace when it's not easy to do. But surprise, grace is not earned, it's offered, because God is so good. So remember that God is so good.